everyone. Yeah, this is the fourth seminar we're going to have on the Book of Certainty, and Sidi Reda, Dr. Reza Shah-Kazemi will make commentary after reading of certain passages. Yeah, and today we have Abdurrahman Adnan. He has agreed, he has consented to read certain passages, and then Dr. Reza Shah-Kazemi will make some commentary. Please.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. This identity of universal man with the divine truth is affirmed in a body utterance, in a holy utterance, Hadith Qudsi, of the truth itself speaking through the mouth of the Prophet. My slave ceaseth not to draw nigh unto me through devotions of free will until I love him. And when I love him, I am the hearing wherewith he heareth, and the sight wherewith he seeth, and the hand wherewith he fighteth, and the foot whereon he walketh. The same is also expressed in another utterance attributed by the Sufis to the Prophet. I am Ahmad without the letter Mim. I am an Arab without the letter Ain. Who hath seen me, the same hath seen the truth. The letter Mim is the letter of death, that is, of ending. And the letter Ain is the letter of the source of creation, that is, of beginning. And in the truth of certainty, all that has to do with beginning and ending has been reabsorbed, leaving only that which has neither beginning nor end, namely Ahad, one, and Rabbi, my Lord. These words refer especially to that aspect of the truth which is named eternity after extinction, al-baqa ba'd al-fana. For all that is subject to change has been extinguished, and that which remains, the eternal, al-baqi, is beyond all change whatsoever. This reminder is the real self, and the self which has a beginning and an end, and which corresponds to Ahmad the Arab, is only an appearance. That the real self is none other than God is also affirmed in yet another utterance of the Prophet. Who knoweth himself, the same knoweth his Lord. The self is all that is left to universal man, in whom the veils of the self which hid it have been utterly consumed by the truth. Thus it is said in the chapter of the cow, we make no distinction between any of his apostles. Quran 2:285. For in the truth of certainty, each of them is nothing but the self, and the self is always one and the same. And it was because of the self, above all, that the angels were told to prostrate themselves before universal man in the form of Adam. The self, which is the truth of certainty, is one, but it is not one with the oneness of a single thing among many, but with oneness which eternally annihilates all duality, and nothing can be added to it so as to make more than one, for it is already infinite. This infinite unity, al-ahadiyyah, is sometimes called he, huwa, and the essence, ad-that. The garden of the essence is therefore the highest of all the paradises, or rather, in the truth of certainty, it is the one paradise, the paradise of him, and nothing may enter it, since everything is already there. Thus, if it be said that one has entered the garden of the essence, the meaning is that his self has been reduced to nothing, and that he has thus been changed from one into naught, since only naught may enter it. This knowledge of the nothingness of oneself is what is called poverty, al-faqr, and it is implied in the utterance of Jesus. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. In respect of poverty, one may see a further meaning in the words, "We make no distinction between any of his apostles, considering this time not so much the self as the selves of the apostles. For though it is said in the chapter of the night journey, and we have favored some of the prophets above others, and unto David we gave the Psalms," Quran 1755. These distinctions of favor only refer to what is below the paradise of the essence, whereas in the essence itself they are all equal in realizing the truth. God is rich and you are the poor. Quran 46:38.
Thank you very much, Abdul Rahman. Much appreciated. I just wonder if we could start by asking the other Abdul Rahman, Abdul Ghazar, or yourself, if you know, can we just have the context of that final verse where it says, "God is the rich and we are the poor." That's 46:38. Can we just see the verse before that and the one after? Has anyone got a copy of the Quran in front of them? No? All right. Well, never mind. Let's wait until someone finds it. In the meanwhile, I'll just go back to the beginning. Can I also see, can I change the screen so that I can see Khalid? No?
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Good. All right. I'd like to start just by asking if there are any questions that arise out of these two pages before I go into a brief commentary on some of the salient principles. Does anybody have any questions?
Perhaps, yes, maybe this is what Shaykh Abū Bakr is explaining, is what have been debated for a long, long time among the Sufis about the wahdatul wujud, and the oneness of being or unity of existence. Is it correct?
Yes, this is one of those places where he is defending the doctrine, or at least expounding the doctrine of the oneness of being. There's a lot of interference coming through at the moment. I don't know who it is that's hasn't got their microphone muted. Yeah, that's better. But yes, all right. Yes, all right. Well, let's go into that then. This is wahdatul wujud and how, in particular, Dr. Lings is talking about the priority. Let's put it that way. The priority, metaphysical priority that must be given to the absolute nature of the extinction that is the prerequisite for subsistence. One of the most baffling, challenging, and potentially scandalizing aspects of wahdatul wujud is its experiential concomitant. The idea of fana and then baqa, because it's from the point of view of baqa, of subsistence, of carrying on, of surviving after the extinction, after you've been effaced. It's that subsistence of the individuality, the apparent subsistence of the individuality, through which God subsists in reality as Al-Baqi, as Dr. Lings has mentioned that name, Al-Baqi, the one who is eternal, the one who subsists eternally. When we say in the Sufi doctrine, Al-Baqa ba'ad al-Fana, it means that something, which is the only thing that can subsist, is actually God, the self. That self subsists. It continues to manifest itself, but not as the absolute. It passes through the veils of the extinguished individuality, the individuality that has been extinguished in Fana, so that the individual will express things that actually have their source in the universal, in the self. That's why Dr. Lings refers to the Hadith Qudsi, the holy saying, that God speaks through, he hears through the slave whom he comes to love. And this love that God has for the individual is tantamount to the extinction that God brings about for the individual, the ultimate expression of God's love for the individual. Remember at the beginning of this Hadith Qudsi, it said that God said, let those who oppose my friend be apprised of war. Hold on a second. Sorry, the door just opened. Let those who من عاد لي وليا فآذنته بالحرب. Whoever opposes or makes war on my friend, let him know that I declare war on him. And then it goes on to speak about how God loves nothing more than the obligatory duties, the ordinary devotions that are made obligatory, incumbent upon everybody. So God loves nothing more than those fara'id, obligatory duties. But then he says, when my slave comes closer to me through the nawafil, understood as the dhikr, then I come to love him. And when I love him, I become this, I become that, I become him. My identity and the identity of the slave become indistinguishable because I hear through him, I see through him, and the same degree of what Dr. Lings has referred to as the supreme identity, the realization of the absolute self, the immanent self within the depths of the heart. When he says, I am the Arab without the letter Ain, I am the Ahmad, what is it? I am the Ahmad without the letter Mim. Now it's important there, Mim, as he says, Dr. Lings, is the letter standing for death, because the Mim has the numerical value of 40, and 40 is the number of death. 40 days in the wilderness, 40 years of the children of Israel in the wilderness. Jesus goes 40 days into the wilderness. 40 days of the exodus, as it were, from ordinary life. It's the letter of death. And the very shape of the letter Mim evokes that, with the apparent fullness of the top, a circular which indicates life, and then curving down, vertically falling, as it were, descending into death at the end of that vertical descent. And when you take away the letter Mim, you have the word Ahad. When you take away the letter Ain, which Dr. Lings says is a symbol for the source of creation. And I'm not sure exactly what that's referring to, other than the fact that the word Ain itself means fountain and source. So that could be the reason why it's identified as the source of creation. But if anyone has any other association between Ain and the beginning of creation, please let me know. So when we're talking about this level of self-realization. It's very, very simple, very simplistic, I should say, to go straight to that saying of the Prophet, Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. He who knows his soul knows his Lord. And to think, well, this self-understanding, self-realization, self-knowledge is so easy. I just have to know myself. But actually, there's a great deal of work to be done, because there is no possibility of knowledge of God without the prior extinction of all of the faculties of individuality that set up an epistemological bipolarity between the subject and the object. That itself is duality. Therefore, there's no possibility of the realization of the unity of selfhood so long as the individual faculties of cognition are operative, so long as the individual is the individual. So the absolute importance of understanding the prerequisite of ontological effacement, that prerequisite of ontological effacement prior to the arising, like phoenix-like out of the ashes. This phoenix rises out of the ashes of annihilation, and that phoenix is the realization of the supreme identity, the one and only that identity that somehow subsists through Al-Baqi, God himself, who manifests through the now effaced individuality. And that's the place from which these great, what are called the Shakhiyat, the ecstatic utterances of the Sufis arise, like famous Anal Haq of Halaj. Halaj could only say such a thing, first of all, in a state, a high of ecstatic consciousness, of a loss of consciousness, let's say, through the intensity of the ecstasy, so that what we have is God speaking through the tongue of Halaj, just like in the Hadith Qudsi. God is speaking through the tongue of the Prophet. Halaj, and by Yazid Bastami, when he said, Subhani, a'adam sha'ni, how glory be to me, how tremendous is my station. He's referring to God speaking through these individuals. So it's like a Hadith Qudsi. The I in question goes back to God. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention is that as I say, the existential concomitant of this doctrine of wahdat al-wujud, which comes about methodically through the remembrance of God, through dhikrullah. And the reason I wanted to find out about the context of that reference to God is the rich and ye are the poor, is because I think there are two places where this idea is expressed in the Quran. This is one of them, and I think the other one is the one that I want to draw your attention to, and I think we mentioned this at the very end of the last seminar, but I brought with me today the Kitab al-Hikam of Sayyidina Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari, in order to read this extraordinary hikmah, this aphorism of wisdom. And I will do that now and go back to the Quranic verse when we finish this reading. So in this hikmah, he says, لا تترك الذكر لعدم حضورك مع الله فيه. Do not abandon the invocation because of the absence of your presence with God therein. So don't stop invoking the name just because you're in a state of ghafla, in a state of heedlessness or distraction. Don't allow that to stop you from invoking the name. لأن غفلتك عن وجود ذكره أشد من غفلتك في وجود ذكره. Because your state of being distracted in the invocation is your state of being distracted from the invocation is much worse than your state of being distracted in the invocation. In other words, just because you're distracted don't stop invoking. Because if you're so distracted that you actually leave the invocation and go and do other things in the world, that's much worse for you than your state of continuing to invoke, even if you're thinking about what you're going to have for dinner and so on and so forth. In other words, Ibn Taymiyyah is saying, keep invoking, don't stop, even if your state of concentration is far from what you would like it to be. Carry on invoking. Why? فعسى أن يرفعك من ذكر مع وجود غفلة إلى ذكر مع وجود يقظة، ومن ذكر مع وجود يقظة إلى ذكر مع وجود حضور، ومن ذكر مع وجود حضور إلى ذكر مع وجود غيبة عما سوى المذكور، وما ذلك على الله بعزيز. And that is not difficult for God at the very end. Now, what he's saying there is, don't allow yourself to be distracted from the invocation. Even if you're distracted in it, continue to invoke in that state of distraction. Why? Because it's possible. It can happen that God will lift you from a dhikr with ghafla, with distraction, to a dhikr with the reality of concentration, yaqada, literally wakefulness, alert. And from a dhikr with the reality of alertness to a dhikr with the reality of presence, hudur. And from a dhikr with the presence, with the reality of presence. And here comes the paradoxical twist at the end of the tale of this extraordinary aphorism, totally understand. And from a dhikr with the presence, with the reality, wujud hudure, with the wujud, with the reality, with the being of hudur, of presence, to a dhikr with the wujud of that of absence, a presence of absence, from a dhikr with the being of that absence of everything apart from the madhkur, apart from the invoked one. So the dhakir has become one with the dhikr, and the dhikr has become one with the madhkur, because everything other than the madhkur, other than the reality invoked, has been effaced by this grace of God, which takes from the individual invoker his limited, specific, and enslaving, let's say, empirical identity, leaving only the supreme identity of the self, of the madhkur, after this process of elevation from distraction to alertness, to presence, to absence of the self, to absence from everything other than the object invoked from the madhkur. And then he finishes by saying, if you think this is difficult, then no. وَمَا ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ بِعَزِيزٍ. This is not difficult for God. This is easy for God, whose grace is unlimited and whose grace is imprescriptible and therefore unpredictable. But all you have to do is concentrate on invoking in a state of fuck. This is the crucial point that Dr. Lings is emphasizing here. That in a state of fuck, in a state of poverty, God can elevate the identity of himself within your individual, within your heart, to make it one with the transcendent reality of the divinity above and beyond your and everything's specificity. So that union between the God within, the God above, the rejoining between immanence and transcendence, where the Dhākir reveals itself as God alone, rejoining itself as the Makur, is predicated on poverty, on effacement. Now, there are two things I'd just like to say before opening up the questions. One is that this poverty is not simply a state of total fana, whereby you are extinguished and God subsists through your extinction. That is the end point of a process. That fana is like the end, the culmination, the climax, the crescendo of a wave of emptying of selfhood, a wave of poverty which is emptying your heart of your own pride, your vanity, your egotism, your subjectivism, your egocentricity, whatever it may be that manifests this element of the ego that needs to be completely effaced. But it will only be completely effaced through that fana, through a total effacement of the individuality and not just of the sins of pride that are attendant upon the continuity of the empirical egocentricity, the genital egocentricity that we have to get rid of. So, going back to this, in other words, Bakr is poverty which is identifiable in its essence with humility and therefore with all of the essential virtues. And that must be a kind of accompaniment. So to the extent that we are fuqara, to the extent that we are truly a faqir, poor, needy, empty of ourselves, to that extent we will be approximating the miraculous reality of God's qualities shining through us on the level of human virtue, until this point of extinction comes when God's radiance through us becomes all the more brilliantly, as it were, radiant and irresistible, and that's when what we feel when we're in the presence of saints who have been effaced by God from egocentricity, and one feels the presence, the hudur of God through these great saints. That's why we refer to the great saints as Hazrat, Hazrat Ali, Hazrat Fatima. So that Hazrat is the Indian Persian form of Hadra, going back to the idea of hudur, presence, the divine presence. And the second thing I want to do is just to relate this hikmah of Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari to the Quranic context, because there are, so far as I know, two places in the Quran where this reference to us as poor and to God as rich comes. And there's one in particular, I think it's the Surah Al-Fatir, and I wonder if Sidi Abdul Rahman or Abdul Ghazar can help to provide this verse. But what I remember is this. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الفقراء يا أيها الناس يا أيها الناس أنتم الفقراء إلى الله والله هو الحميد الحميد. O mankind, ye are the poor in relation to God, and God, He is the rich, the owner of praise. وَإِنْ يَشَأْ يُذْهِبْكُمْ وَيَأْتِ بِخَلْقٍ جَدِيدٍ وَمَا ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ بِعَزِيزٍ. If He wishes, He could remove you and replace you with a new creation. خَلْقٍ جَدِيدٍ وَمَا ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ بِعَزِيزٍ. And that is not difficult for God. So when Ibn Ata'illah is finishing his hikmah on that note of that is not difficult for God, it's like an ishara to that Quranic context where we are described as the fuqara, God is the rich. If He wishes, He could take us away. In other words, in the words of the hikmah, He could remove our state of ghafla, replacing it with a state of alertness. He could remove the state of alertness and replace it with a state of concentration and hudur, presence. And he could remove even that station of concentration, of hudur, with this ultimate station of removing everything, removing the absence of having the absence of everything other than the maf'ul, other than that which is the invoked. And that is not difficult for God. Now, when we're talking about that final station of removal of ghibatin ma siwal maf'ul, the absence of everything other than God, we're talking about, first and foremost, the removal of our individual empirical reality and its replacement with a new substance, a khalq jadid, in the words of the Quran. If God wishes, He could remove you and replace you with a new creation. That is not difficult for God. So this miraculous transformation that God is capable of for us is something we should always keep in our minds as we go through the process, the long and difficult, arduous process of trying to basically think of God, to be aware of God, to invoke the divine reality, and to have total faith in God's capacity, the grace that God has to transform our states of abstraction and distraction and consciousness to become a state of a continuous flow of awareness of God and God's presence flowing through us. So I'll stop there and ask if there are any questions.
Just a small, I think, a correction to the, I think there's a mistake in the reference.
Right.
God is the rich and you are the poor. That's Quran 47, chapter 47, Surah 47, Surah Muhammad, verse 38.
Right.
Not 46 as in the book.
Right, yes, that's one of the two places where this idea is given. The other one I think is Surah Al-Fatir.
Surah Fatir, Surah number 35, ayat number 15.
And can you remind us how that goes?
Surah Fatir, ayat 35. Surah number 35, ayat number 15. يا أيها الناس أنتم الفقراء إلى الله والله هو الغني الحميد إن يشاء يذهبكم ويأتي بخلق جديد. That's the one you want.
وما ذلك
وما ذلك على الله بعزيز.
Yeah. So that's the one that Ibn Ata'illah is most probably referring, and that's the verse to which he's referring, and therefore the context. And he doesn't say any of that in the hikmah, but he knows that the people who are going to be reading his aphorism will make the link between what he's saying about the dhikr and what God is saying about the khalq jadid in relation to وَمَا ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ بِعَزِيزٍ. As I say, I think there's another place in the Quran where that phrase comes, وَمَا ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ بِعَزِيزٍ, but I don't remember it as being so directly relevant as the possible source of this particular inspiration. So thank you for clarifying that, and we'll alert the publishers. And maybe with these old editions that we have, and in the new editions, that mistake in the Book of Certainty has been put right. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? If there aren't any, then I will just finish with another point that struck me when, 2 points actually, that struck me when I was reading this. We make no distinction between any of the apostles, the Quran says. And Dr. Lings says that the distinctions of favor refer only to what is below the paradise of the essence. Whereas in the essence itself, they are all equal in realizing the truth. I just wanted to point out that this is identical almost to the wording of Ibn Arabi in one of his passages where he speaks about tafadul, tafdil, tafadul, the ranking in degrees of favor, of grace. And he says, Ibn Arabi says that all of the awliya, all the prophets, the messengers, the saints, all of those who have realized the supreme identity, all of those who are awliya Allah, they are all absolutely indistinguishable in the Garden of the Essence. In, I think he calls it nafs al-haq, the very soul of the real, ultimate reality. And that they only have the tafadul in the degrees of paradise and in this world that are below the paradise of the essence. So what Dr. Ling says there is almost verbatim from Ibn Arabi, without, I'm sure he hasn't read it from Ibn Arabi. It's remarkable how great minds think alike, and that wording is almost identical to what Ibn Arabi said. And the last point is relating to the middle of page 5, where Dr. Ling says, since the being is utterly extinguished in the truth, he cannot be said to have gained possession of its riches, for in reality he has never ceased to possess them. So this is quite a paradox, that he cannot be said to have gained anything because he already yet never ceased. God has never ceased to possess them, and that individual's consciousness identified in an absolute sense with its own immanent source has never ceased to be in possession of all of these riches, has never ceased to be infinite. And this made me think of something marvelous that Meister Eckhart said in one of his German sermons. That when and that's not verbatim, it's from memory, that when I return to the ground, the Grund in German, the ground that found the essence, the source of God, which is beyond God, no one will ask me where I have been, because no one will have missed me. Meaning he has never been absent, but not he as Eckhart, rather that spiritual spark of consciousness infinitely integrated within the absolute. That has never actually left the essence. That has always been. Nothing can be added to the essence, as Dr. Ling said earlier in this passage, that the divine unity is eternally burning, extinguishing all duality. And nothing can be added to that unity. It's absolute oneness. So nothing can be added to it by entering into it, like us, quote, as if we could enter the essence or re-enter. And nothing can leave it. It's absolute oneness. And this is the paradox and the mysterious power that Eckhart was given, this inspirational power to express in this startling paradox of no one missed me. I was always there, but how could I be there as Eckhart when my individuality is, as a creature, nothing? Remember, Eckhart used to say that the creature is a pure nothing, nichte, is a pure nothing, not a little something, but a pure nothing. It's only as a pure nothing that whatever is real in the creature can re-enter that from which it never emerged. Now these are paradoxes after paradox, but this is what distinguishes the words of a saint who has realized these things and who puts into language what evades, eludes, transcends all possible cognitive appreciation of these spiritual, mystical, metaphysical realities. And just to finish on that note, when Ramakrishna, the great Hindu saint of the 19th century, was asked, what is it like when you go into samadhi, when you go into this state of complete ecstasy? And Ramakrishna would either be completely unconscious going into this samadhi, or he would be conscious and then making wonderful gestures, to some extent conscious and making these gestures of dancing and singing. But he was asked, what is it with this samadhi, which is nirbija in Sanskrit, beyond the scene of subsequent karmic regeneration, the highest samadhi, which leads to the highest realization of Paramatma. And he was asked, so what is it like when this happens? And he says, if you think of a doll that's made out of salt, and that doll goes into the ocean and dissolves in the ocean, how can that doll come out of the ocean and tell you what it was like when he got dissolved? That's the paradox. That something actually of the doll does reconstitute and it does come out of the ocean. Because Ramakrishna still continues as an individual. But what he's saying is this is the paradoxical impossibility of it in any way relating the limitations of individual cognition and language with the infinitude of selfhood that goes beyond all limitations of the human order. So that's a bit like the paradox that another great saint of recent times, Ramana Maharshi, he was asked by one of his disciples who lived in New York, "Oh, Ramana, I'm practicing this method of self-inquiry. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And, I think I may be getting closer to an understanding of the self. But what do I do to my fellow New Yorkers who are still steeped in ignorance?" And Ramana said that something like this, that if I'm in a dream and I dream of various people, and then I wake up from that dream, is it my duty to go back into the dream and wake up the people of whom I was dreaming? Beautiful. Absolutely stunning. The freshness of this formulation, this inspiration that helps us to see that unless we're in a state of hayra, of bewilderment, when we come to think about these ultimate realities, we are nowhere. These things go beyond our rational categories, infinitely beyond. So it's like a Zen koan that is actually the best way of trying to understand these things, not to explicate them logically, doctrinally, this way and that way, because people are always going to raise up some rational problem or legal problem or theological problem with what we're saying. The only way, and this is what Eckhart says in one of his sermons, when he's talking about poverty, incidentally, it's a German sermon on poverty. He says, I plead with you, before I start this sermon, I plead with you to have a little bit of this poverty of which I'm going to speak. Because if you don't have a little bit of what I'm talking about, you won't understand a word of what I'm talking about. You have to have had a taste, a bowl of the absolute nature of the satisfaction that comes from being aware of your absolute indigence and your thirst. The satisfaction of that thirst you have to already taste within the intensity of your thirst if you are to understand what I'm going to talk about. So along those lines. And that again goes back to the great Jalaluddin Rumi, where سینه خواهم شرح اسرار تا بگویم شرح درد اشتیاق. What I want, before I can even give you a commentary on the pain of longing, is I want your breast to be torn to shreds through the pain of separation. If you're not aware of how separate you are, and you're not aware of how that awareness of separation is actually the seed of ultimate exaltation, sublimation of all of your possible desires, then I can't even begin to give you the commentary of the pain of longing for reunion after separation, the reed flute that wants to rejoin the bed from which it was ripped. That's the great symbol of our individual existence, having been ripped from the bed of the essence of universal infinitude. Anyway, I've spoken for far too long, and please, I plead with all of you not to be like this or like that, but I plead, give me a few questions next time, because otherwise I'll just rabbit on, waffle on.
Yes, I have a question, but quite a long one. I think I should reserve it for next session. Yeah.
I do have a comment though, if that's still all right. It's just with regards to the letter Ain in the Hadith. I am Ahmed bila mim and Rab bila Ain. Arabi bila Ain. Yeah. So yeah, when you said it talks about the beginning. So yes, it's true. In the symbolism of the letter Ain, one of the things I understand that Ain represent in the drawing represent a pregnant woman, and so that is obviously represent the beginning of creation, which resonates very well with what you described beautifully about the beginning and the end, because the meme is the hangman, which represents the death as you described. So that is there. And I do have the other thing. I do have the full verse, if you want me to, which was mentioned in the chapter, the verse about God is the rich and ye are the poor. It's part of a verse. I can read it out loud if you like. So it goes like this: Lo, ye are those who are called to spend in the way of God. Yet among you there are some who hold. And as for him who holdeth, he holdeth only from his soul. And God is the rich, and ye are the poor. And if ye turn away, he will exchange you for some other folk, and they will not be the likes of you. So it resonates with the other verse that you mentioned about Ibn Atta as well. So I thought I mentioned it.
Thank you very, very much. Yeah. All right, everybody, look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks' time. And,
Inshallah.
Inshallah. And as I said, can we stop recording now?
Yes.
Yeah.